23rd of November 2016. Meditators have been practicing Metta Bhavana, loving kindness meditation for 3 days. So all meditators shall begin the practice of mindfulness meditation, insight meditation, starting tomorrow. So meditators shall develop mindfulness from one moment to next moment, from one object to next object, starting tomorrow. Meditators may practice loving kindness meditation for about 15 minutes at the beginning of sitting meditation. So every session of sitting meditations, meditators begin with Metta Bhavana. You may practice Metta Bhavana or loving kindness for yourself about 2 or 3 minutes. Then meditators have to choose a good object of metta. For example, you are practicing loving kindness towards a few specific objects, a few individuals for 3 days. So you may be able to know which object or which person is your best object of metta. A best object of metta can be your meditation teacher or your mother or good friends who has been very kind and helpful in your life, in your careers, and so on. So in other words, when you think about this object, you have a strong wish or aspirations. You want him or her to be healthy, to be free from suffering, and so on. Or in other words, that object can help you or enable you to develop your feelings of loving kindness or your mental states of loving kindness. So you wish that object, for example, your teachers, or may my teachers be well, happy, peaceful, may my teachers be healthy always. So you wish the object repeatedly for about 10 minutes or over 10 minutes. Some meditators have to wish the objects sincerely with awareness. So that mental wish is totally different from mantra. So we are not chanting of the mantra, but we make an effort, a sincere effort to wish the welfare and happiness of the objects of loving kindness. Meditators should not verbalize it. They should make the wish in the mind. So in that way, meditators practice metta meditation for about 15 minutes or up to 20 minutes. Then they have to switch over to the practice of mindfulness meditation. So, as you know, the purpose of practicing mindfulness meditation is to realize the mental and physical phenomena as they really are. You may have the experiences in the practice of mindfulness meditation, vipassana bhavana. So um, as an important reminders, meditators should not have any expectations during the practice. You have to put aside your preconceived ideas or your preconceptions about the meditation. You have to put aside your preconceived ideas or preconceptions about the experiences of meditations or the experience of the pain and so on. So you have to rely on your personal experience or your direct experience at that present moment. If meditators are mindful of any objects or any phenomena with preconceptions or preconceived ideas, they may not be able to realize the true natures of the phenomena. You also do not mindful of any object based on your own past experiences. So in other words, you mindful of every object or every phenomenon as something new that's arising at that moment. So meditators have to be mindful of other objects or phenomenon that's predominantly arising at that moment. So meditators do not have a single object of meditations. There are varieties of objects or phenomena to be mindful of. So sometimes meditators may not have any distinct object or an object that's very dominant and that is very conspicuous to the mind. So when there's no distinct object, there's no strong object that's arising at that moment, meditators need not have to search for an object or look for an object to be mindful of. Meditators can mindful of the basic objects of sitting meditation or the primary objects of sitting meditations. So this basic object of sitting meditation is known as Mula Kammatthana in Pali. Mula Kammatthana. Kammatthana is an object of phenomena that help you to develop the mind. Mula here means beginning, at the beginning. So there are so many phenomena to be mindful of. There are varieties of objects. So meditators have to begin from somewhere or from an object. The meditators have to begin from somewhere or from an object that is clear to the mind always. So in this meditation, we begin with the physical phenomena. The physical phenomena is known as rupa in Pali. So physical phenomena or rupa consists mainly the four material elements. So the four material elements, as you know, are earth element, fire element, wind element, and water elements. So at each moment, there's only one element becomes dominant. For example, our objects of Mula Kammatthana is the movements of the abdomen. When we are mindful of the movements of abdomen, that movements also includes the other material elements. When we are mindful of the movement of abdomen, that object also includes other material elements. But that because the movement is the most dominant, so that's why we perceive the movements and be mindful of it as it duly occurs. But the movement is the most dominant at that time, so that's why we perceive it and be mindful of it as it duly occurs. So movements or motions supporting the nature support is the characteristics or the nature of the wind element, or in other words, is known as the specific characteristics of the wind element. So, as you're mindful of the movement of domens, if there's another object arising, for example, hot, then you should mindful of that object because that object is more dominant than the movements of abdomen. So, hot or cold is the manifestations of the fire element. So, at that moment, we cannot be mindful of the hot and cold at the same time. So, when the one element, when one material element is manifested, for example, fire element, we cannot mindful of the hot and cold at the same moment. If the hot is become dominant, then we mindful as hot. If the coldness becomes more dominant, then we be mindful of the coldness. So similarly, when meditators perceive hardness and softness, that is due to the manifestations of earth element, then they should be mindful of them as they really are. And the water element has the characteristics of cohesion and fluidity. So we begin the mindfulness meditation with one of the material elements. One of the material elements. Although we call the rising falling movement of abdomen as the primary object in English, but it doesn't mean the most important object. Every object is equally important. In other words, when you could mindful of any object attentively, precisely, you may realize some experiences or even some insight knowledge or enlightenment. But we do not be mindful of the material elements only. Whenever there's any mental state arising, then meditators should be mindful of that mental state immediately. For example, as meditators are mindful of the movements of the abdomen, then they realize that the mind is thinking of something. They should be mindful of that thinking immediately. When the mind is thinking of something, meditators should not bring the mind back to the basic objects of sitting meditation. When meditators are mindful of any mental states, thinking or past memory, they should be mindful of them as they really occur. They should not purposely stop the thinking or stop the memory or cut off it. It is important to realize every mental state as it duly occurs. It is because meditation is mental training or mental culture. So be mindful of mental states is the most important factors to make progress. Whenever meditators mindful of any object, they also make an effort to make mental noting or to make mental labelings. For example, when meditators mindful of the rising movements of abdomens, first of all, they must perceive that there's a movements of rising, then they make mental noting. Meditators should not let the mind stay with the words. That means you do not pay attention to the mental noting or the labeling. The mindfulness should stay with the movements of the abdomen. So that mental noting helps you to lead the mind to the objects that you were noting at that time. Sometimes meditators perceive the arising of the object, but they have not yet made the mental noting, then the object had disappeared. So when the object has disappeared, they should not make any mental noting. Meditators can make mental noting because the object has been arising and has not yet disappeared at that moment. So meditators cannot make mental noting if the object has not yet arisen or the object has disappeared. So meditators begin the sitting meditation by practicing metta for about 15 minutes. Then they may begin the vipassana meditation or mindfulness meditation by being mindful of the movements of the abdomen. Movements of the abdomen is a natural process. So when meditators sit with the body and mind relaxed, keeping the breath normal, natural, then they may be able to perceive the abdomen is moving forward, moving inward, or expanding, contracting. If the movement is not clear, then meditators should not intentionally or purposely take a deep breath in order to make the movements clearer. They should not use any force or physical effort in order to make the abdomen move clearer. If the movements of abdomen is not clear, in other words, difficult to perceive and mindful of it, meditators need not have to force the mind to catch it. Meditators have the alternative. The alternative is to be mindful that you are sitting, or be aware that you are sitting with the upright postures and taking note mentally, sitting, be mindful of the upright postures. So at the moment of mindful of the upright postures, meditators should not do the way of body scanning, or you do not scan your body. So meditators be aware that they are sitting with the upright postures and note it as sitting. Then in the next moment, meditators can mindful of the context of body. Usually is known as the touching point. For example, you will place your hand above the knee, so you may perceive the touching of a hand with the knee. So you mindful and note it as touching. So you mindful, for example, the touching of the left hand with the knee, and note it as touching. Then be mindful of touching of the right hand with the knee, and note it as touching. Then you mindful of the sitting posture again, and note it as sitting. Then you mindful of the first touching point again, the touching of the left hand with the knee, touching, touching of the right hand with the knee, touching continuously. So when meditators are mindful of sitting, touching, and so on, if the movements of the abdomen becomes clear again by itself, then meditators be mindful of movement of abdomen again and note it as it is. So as meditators are mindful of sitting or touching, if they realize that the mind is thinking of something, they should be mindful and note the thinking until the thinking has disappeared by itself. So when thinking has disappeared, if the movements of abdomen is clear, they mindful of the movement of abdomen. If the movements of the abdomen is very weak, difficult to perceive it, then they can mindful of sitting postures and the touching point again. Sometimes meditators mindful and note thinking, and that when the thinking disappears, a strong painful sensation arising, then meditators should mindful of that strong painful sensation. So when meditators are mindful and note pain, they have to be perceive the actual process of the painful sensation. As meditators are mindful of pain or any physical discomfort such as numbness and so on, then they realize that the mind is reacting to it. Then they should be mindful of that mental reactions. For example, meditators thinking when this pain is going away, then should mindful and know it's thinking. If there's a feeling of dislike towards the pain, then they mindful and note dislike. If there's a desire to move, to change the sitting positions in order to relieve the pain, then meditators should mindful and note desire. So whenever meditators experience pain or any physical discomfort, they have to train themselves to be patient with this pain or physical discomfort. If the pain or any physical discomfort becomes unbearable, and meditators have been sitting for more than half an hour or 40 minutes, and the pain is getting unbearable, they may stop their sitting and proceed to walking meditation again. If meditators keep on moving or adjusting the sitting positions or the postures, whenever there's a pain, then it becomes a habit, a practice. And that habit is not a good habit, but is a hindrance. It becomes a hindrance to the progress of mindfulness, concentration, and insight knowledge. So when meditators have determinations, then they may able to increase the duration of sitting gradually. So it's important to keep in mind the principle or the guidelines of the practice. Sometimes meditators do not know what to be mindful, but as long as they remember the principle of the practice, then they will know how to be mindful or what to be mindful. So the principle or the guideline of the practice is to be mindful whatever object, either a mental object or physical object that is predominantly arising at that moment as it duly occurs. If there's no object that's very dominant or very clear, then meditators come back to the basic objects of sitting meditation immediately. So meditators come back to the movements of abdomens and perceive the movements as it is, note it as rising, falling. If the movements of rising, falling is not clear or disappear, then meditators mindful of the alternative. There's a sitting postures and the any two clear touching points. So at each movement, meditators can only be mindful of one touching point. Or like for example, just to give the example, the touching of the left hand with the knee, touching, touching of the right hand with the knee, touching. Be mindful of the sitting posture again, and note it as sitting, and so on. Whenever there are two different objects happening at the same time, one is a mental object, the other is a physical object. So in this case, meditators should give priority to the mental objects. There are many mental objects. Sometimes meditators did not realize it. For example, sometimes meditators analyze the object, analyze the painful sensation, and so on. And so meditators should be quick enough to note it as analyzing. Sometimes meditators compare the experience with pre-existing or previous retreats. Then they should quickly mindful and note it as comparing or thinking, and so on. So sometimes meditators also judge their own practice or their concentration, judging that my concentration is getting better, and so on. So whenever meditators are judging their experience or making comparisons between the experience now and in the past, they are no longer in the present moment. They are not in the present moment anymore. So it's important not to miss any mental states. So in that way, meditators develop mindfulness from one moment to next moment, and from one object to next object. So at the beginning, so at the end of sitting meditation, when meditators want to get up or stand up, they should be mindful of the process of standing up, and so on. Every sitting meditation should be preceded by walking meditations. So at the beginning of the vipassana retreats, it's better that meditators walk for 1 hour. So as you know, you have to walk in your own path, forward, backward. You have to walk in your own path, your walking path, up and down. So as you know, at the beginning of walking, you have to be mindful that they are standing. Note it as standing, at least 5 or 6 times, or even nearly 10 times. So when meditators are mindful of standing postures, they just perceive the standing directly. They should not do what they call body scanning. You do not scan your body. So then you begin to walk. First of all, you're mindful and note left, right, perceiving the actual process of the movements, and then know it. So that mental noting is a brief noting, or is a brief noting. In other words, you should not purposely drag your noting in order to synchronize with the movements. If you try to drag your noting in order to synchronize with the movements, it can become tiring, because you try to control your noting in order to synchronize with the movements. So the actual experience of the movements is more important. We do not try to realize the objects through the noting. We do not try to realize the objects through the mental noting. We try to realize the object through direct experience. For example, when you perceive that your left foot is moving, so you mindful and note it as left. So your mindfulness should stay with the movements. So when your mindfulness staying with the movements, at that time you are experiencing the movements as it is. So you do not think about the movements. Or when you're mindful of any object, your mind is not thinking of that object. So in that way, meditators mindful note left, right, left, right. When meditators reach the end of walking path, be mindful of standing, note it as it is a few times, then be mindful of turning, be mindful of the turning movements of the body. Then meditators be mindful and note the standing posture again, standing, note it about 5 times or 6 times or nearly 10 times, then they begin to walk again. So meditators mindful and note left, right for about 15 minutes. Then they slow down their movements and mindful of 3 phases of steps. They are lifting, pushing and dropping. So in the way, meditators be mindful of lifting, pushing, dropping until the end of that sessions of walking. At the end of the walking meditation, it's important to walk mindfully to the place of sitting, sit down mindfully. So in other words, it's important to carry forward the mindfulness and concentration that you have gained in your walking. You have to carry forward that mindfulness and concentration into your sitting. So we can say that during walking meditations, the basic objects are the movements of foot, left, right, then lifting, pushing, dropping, standing, turning, standing. So these are the basic objects of walking meditations. But when there's another object arising and is more dominant than the movements of foot or your standing postures or the turning movements, then you should be mindful of the other object which becomes more dominant at that time. And whenever there's a mental state arising, for example thinking, analyzing the experience, then meditators should be mindful of that mental state immediately and note it as thinking, perceiving the process of the thinking until it has disappeared by itself. Then meditators resume the walking or start to walk again. In other words, whenever meditators are mindful of other objects, they it's better that they stop walking at that time and be mindful of that object. For example, you perceive a strong itchy sensations, then you stop your walking and mindful and note it as itchy, and so on. Or when you realize there's thinking, you stop your walking immediately and mindful and note the thinking until it has disappeared. If you do not stop walking and mindful of the other dominant object, you may not be able to mindful of it well. For example, when you realize there's a thinking, but you keep on walking, sometimes unconsciously the mindfulness come back to the movements again. So it's better to stop walking when you are mindful of another dominant object. And during walking, you have to practice restraints on your eyes. Restraining your eyes not to look here and there, but just look at in front about 5 or 6 feet ahead. So besides practicing walking and sitting meditations, meditators do spend time on their daily activities or the routine activities such as eating your breakfast, lunch, or walking from one place to another place, and so on. So it's important to be mindful of your daily activities so that you have more and more constant mindfulness, sustained mindfulness. Constant and continuous mindfulness is another important factor to make progress. At the beginning of the Vipassana retreats, you may not be able to mindful of every process of movements. There's a tendency to become unmindful. So you need to be patient and train yourself to slow down gradually. So whenever you're mindful of any movements, you also try to make mental noting. For example, stretching, or bending. Sometimes when you make use of the common facilities, for example, the restrooms or the washroom, for brushing or washing your face, taking showers, you may not have to slow down. It's because these common facilities are shared with other meditators. Other meditators also need to use these facilities. Then at that time you learn to practice general mindfulness, or be mindful of your washing, cleaning, and without mental noting or without labeling. So the time you practice general mindfulness without mental noting. It means you may not have to make mental note when you cannot slow down at that time. But when you're practicing daily activities at other places, other time, for example, when you sit down to take your breakfast or lunch, so there's a time you can do it slower and be mindful as much as possible and note it as well. So it's important to train yourself to slow down gradually. Sometimes if you put too much of intentional effort to slow down, it can also distract your mindfulness. Too much of intentional effort to slow down. Most of us have to move quite fast, rapidly in daily life. sometimes we have to walk quite fast and so on. So when we come to retreats, we have to learn to slow down or train ourselves to slow down. So that requires some intentional effort to slow down. But if you try to do it very, very slowly, right at the beginning of the retreats, then you may put more intentional effort or stronger intentional effort to do it. So it can cause a distraction to your mindfulness. But if you train yourself to slow down gradually, then it can help you to develop the mindfulness very well. It can become a habit in your retreats. It becomes very natural in your retreats. So we have these three aspects of practice: walking meditation, sitting meditations, and mindfulness of daily activities. We should practice well all the three aspects of practice. So as long as you could remember the principle or the guideline of the practice, most likely you shall stay on the path of the practice. So I wish to emphasize again, just learn to be mindful as it duly occurs, without any expectations or applying any preconceptions or preconceived idea at that time. We have to realize the true nature of the phenomena through direct experience. We do not conceptualize the experience. We do not even think that this object is impermanent or this object is dukkha, but we want to realize it through direct experience. So we can say that mindfulness meditation is beyond thinking, analyzing, conceptualizing, or using any preconception or preconceived idea during the practice. The only things or duty of meditators is to be mindful again, repeatedly. So the immediate purpose of the practice is to strengthen the mindfulness so that the mindfulness becomes more and more attentive, energetic and precise. Then at the same time make an effort so that the mindfulness becomes more and more constant and continuous. So when the mindfulness, or in other words, when the power of mindfulness is strengthened, definitely you shall gain concentration and some experiences in mindfulness meditation. So I wish every meditator rightly understands the principle and the technique of mindfulness meditation, so that every meditator could practice rightly, correctly. Eventually you gain concentration and experiences in mindfulness meditations.